I've got my slice here. I topped it with a little extra crème anglaise because it's delicious. And I'm gonna give it a try. This dessert is like, it's all of the best parts of a fruitcake without being as much as a fruitcake, you know? A Christmas pudding is unlike anything else on a holiday table because it takes a lot of work. It has a ton of really interesting ingredients that you wouldn't at first think to throw together. And it steams for 5 hours on the stovetop, which is honestly just insane. But that's part of what makes it really special, and that's part of what gives it its really unique texture and flavor. So follow along and learn how to make our Christmas pudding. I promise the bourbon-soaked crumb and all of the dried fruits and spices are ideal for a holiday dessert that is set apart from all the rest. Before we can make our Christmas pudding, we have to infuse all of the dried fruits that go into the pudding with some bourbon and some orange zest. And I highly recommend doing this the night before. That gives the fruit a ton of time to hydrate from the bourbon and also gives time for those orange oils to kind of flavor everything. So here are all of my dried fruits. I have a half a cup of dried currants, 1 whole cup of raisins, a half a cup of golden raisins, a half a cup of prunes that I've chopped, and 2 tablespoons of crystallized ginger that I've chopped. And I'm just gonna transfer all of this into my quart container. Now I'm just gonna zest my orange. And I'm gonna add in my half a cup of bourbon. I'm just gonna close my quart container and shake it up. All right, and I'm gonna set this aside and we'll make the rest of the batter tomorrow. In my stand mixer, I'm gonna combine half a cup of unsalted butter. It's already at room temperature because that just makes it easier to cream with the sugar. And 1 cup of brown sugar. You can use light or dark brown sugar, whatever you have in your cupboard. All right, I'm gonna close this and beat this on medium-high until it's nice and light and fluffy, which is about 2 to 3 minutes. I'm gonna scrape down the sides of my bowl and add 2 tablespoons of molasses, which has just a really rich flavor that we associate with things like gingerbreads or really rich spiced Christmas desserts. All right, and this recipe calls for 2 eggs. So you're gonna add the eggs 1 at a time, waiting until the first is incorporated before adding the second. And again, we're just gonna beat this until it becomes really light and airy. Okay, and to this mixture, we're gonna add all of that incredible dried fruit that's been infused with the orange and the bourbon. One of the things that makes a Christmas pudding so special is that the ratio of dry ingredients and liquid ingredients to just this really flavorful dried fruit is very different than most other desserts. It's kind of like a fruitcake in that there's a ton of dried fruit packed into this, but since it's had time to rehydrate and become moist with the bourbon, and as it kind of commingles with the other flavorings in the pudding, it takes on this extra special, extra decadent quality that is just lovely for the holidays. So we're gonna mix this dried fruit in and then combine our dry ingredients. My first ingredient is 2 cups of plain breadcrumbs. Again, breadcrumbs is probably something you haven't really baked with unless you were alive in the 1800s, and that's okay, just roll with it. It makes it have a really unique texture, and it's really, really nice. So to the 2 cups of plain breadcrumbs, I'm gonna add a half a cup of all-purpose flour. This helps soak up a lot of the hydration that's coming from the liquid ingredients. 1/3 cup of almond flour, and this is gonna make it a little extra moist, a little extra nutty. Here I have a half a teaspoon of baking powder, a half a teaspoon of ground cinnamon, a 1/4 teaspoon of kosher salt, a 1/4 teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and a 1/4 teaspoon of ground cloves. If you've already measured these spices out, you can already tell it smells like Christmas. And that's thanks to that like magic trio of cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg. All right, so I'm just gonna whisk this together to combine it. And now we'll take our dry ingredients and just add them into our mixer and mix it on low speed until everything is incorporated. It's gonna be a kind of a clumpy mess, but I promise it'll come together. All right, everything has come together and it probably looks more like a cookie dough than a cake batter or something, but it's not a cookie. It'll look pretty different once it's done cooking. Since this is a dessert that was made quite literally hundreds of years ago, that means that the term pudding here has a different meaning than how we use it. It's more how it's used in Great Britain. The pudding is not going to be a liquid substance. It's going to be almost more like a cake. But what's unique about it is that it's not baked in the oven. Instead, it's steamed in a pot. And we're gonna steam this pastry for 5 hours, which is a long time. So that also means that it's gonna require some equipment and some preparation of equipment that's different than most other baked goods you've probably made. So the first thing you need is a pudding basin, which is essentially just a ceramic bowl with a lip on the side. This lip is gonna be important because we're going to tie a parchment paper aluminum foil cover over this, and this lip allows the kitchen twine that we're going to use to tie that onto the top to stay in place. So this is my 1.5 liter pudding basin, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to generously butter the inside of this so that when the pudding's done it can easily be slipped out. And I'm also going to lay a circle of parchment paper in the bottom. When we take this pudding out of the basin, we're gonna run a knife around the edge just to loosen it up. And if you already have parchment paper on the bottom, that means you run zero risk of the pastry sticking to the bottom of the bowl. It'll just slip right out. Buttering the dish in advance also helps that circle of parchment paper stay in place at the bottom of the basin. Okay, and now we're just gonna transfer and pack our dough into the basin, and you wanna really press down so that you get any air pockets that might be stuck inside the batter to come out. I like to do this in layers just to make sure I'm not getting any big air pockets in there. This batter smells pretty intensely of the spices that we incorporated and the bourbon. It's kind of making me salivate a little bit. Okay, this next step might seem tricky, but I promise it's actually really simple. What you need is 2 rectangles or squares of parchment paper and aluminum foil that are larger than the surface of this by at least 4 inches. It can be a little bigger too. And you'll take the parchment paper and just fold it in half, and then take the aluminum foil and fold it in half. Then we're gonna line up the creases of the parchment paper with the aluminum foil, stacking the aluminum foil on top. That way you have the parchment paper fully encased in the aluminum foil. And then you're gonna put it on top of the pudding basin, making kind of like a little dome or a tent. You can just leave the top as it is while we get the twine ready. You just need a piece of twine that's big enough to wrap around the basin and tie a knot. It's always a good idea, in my opinion, to go larger than you think you're gonna need because you can always cut it down. I wanna keep this little dome here so that the pudding has space to expand. We're just gonna press around the aluminum foil and parchment paper around the edge of the basin and tie the twine tightly underneath the lip of the basin, but on top of the aluminum foil. And this just creates a really delicate lid so that the pudding can steam properly on the stove. Voila, my basin is ready to steam. And you can see that the twine is wrapped nicely and tightly around, allowing some of the aluminum foil to tent the pudding. We're not done. You need a deep pot that you can place a small dish or a steaming basket in the bottom of. And what we're gonna do is we're gonna put this basin inside the pot on top of the dish. You don't want the bottom of the basin to touch the bottom of the pot because then it will come in direct contact with the heat. Instead, by putting a dish or a steaming basket at the bottom of the deep pot, what you're allowing plenty of space for water and steam to warm and gently cook the pudding. That's all we're trying to do here. It might seem kind of complicated, but we're really just making sure that we steam it without scorching it. And now that my pudding basin is sitting nicely on top of the ramekin that I have in this pot, I'm gonna fill the pot up until it comes halfway up the side of the pudding basin and put it over medium heat until it starts to steam. Once it's steaming, I'll reduce the heat to low, cover the pot, and let it steam for 5 hours. I highly recommend checking every hour just to make sure that the pot doesn't run out of water, because if it does, then you could have a burning situation that you're gonna wanna avoid. Just by checking every hour, you make sure there's enough water in there, and if it gets a bit low, just top it up with a little more water and let it keep steaming. All right, I have the water added. I'm gonna put it over the heat. After 5 hours, we're gonna delicately take the pudding basin out and just let it cool a little bit before we remove the pudding from the pudding basin. Mind you, it's gonna be really hot, so just be very careful as you're taking it out of the steaming pot. All right, we're gonna let it cool for a bit, and then I'm gonna take the wrapping off and we will plate it. I have let this cool down, so it shouldn't be steaming anymore. And I'm going to take the lid off and use a butter knife to run around the edge of the basin. Okay, now I'm just gonna place a plate on top and flip it over. And because the parchment paper circle is on the bottom, it should slip right out. Here we have our perfect Christmas pudding. Now we're gonna make the syrup that we're gonna brush this with, and also the crème anglaise that we'll serve it with. Altogether, this is like a super decadent Christmas treat, so let's keep going. So now that the pudding is done, we just need to make the syrup and the crème anglaise. And I know at this point, you're like, geez, this is about 1 million ingredients and 1,000,003 steps, and just trust me, like, you've made it this far, just keep going. I promise in the end, it's really special and it's worth it. So the first thing we're gonna make is a super simple bourbon syrup. And we're just gonna combine 2 tablespoons of bourbon with 2 tablespoons of water, which I've already got in this glass, and then a 1/4 cup of sugar. I'm gonna combine these in the pot and then bring them to a boil, remove them from the heat, and the syrup is done. And then we can focus on the crème anglaise. Water boils at a higher temperature than alcohol does. So by bringing it to a boil, you burn off all of the alcohol so that the syrup doesn't have as sharp of an alcohol taste, but really just carries over the rich flavors that are found in bourbon. So we're gonna set our syrup aside, and now we're gonna make our crème anglaise. We've made it to the last component of this dessert, and that is our crème anglaise, which is a warm vanilla creamy sauce. If you were to take the crème anglaise and chill it and throw it in an ice cream churner, you would have ice cream. It's the same thing. And so it's a really simple thing to make. You just have to follow a few steps kind of carefully. So here I have a 1/2 cup of whole milk and a 1/2 cup of heavy cream. You could also use 1 full cup of 1/2 and 1/2 as a replacement. And then in this bowl, I'm gonna combine the rest of the crème anglaise ingredients. So I have 3 egg yolks, a 1/4 cup of granulated sugar. I'm gonna throw in a pinch of salt and a 1/2 teaspoon of vanilla extract. If you've ever made ice cream before, you know it's really important to temper the egg yolks that go into the base. And it's the same thing with crème anglaise. So what we're gonna do is warm our milk and cream mixture in a saucepan until it's just steaming. We don't want it to come to a boil. You can see here that the milk is already starting to steam, so I'm gonna turn off the heat. And then we're gonna take the milk mixture off the heat and mix only a little bit in with the egg yolk mixture, just to slowly increase the temperature of the yolks. Then we're gonna add this warmed yolk mixture to the milk and cream, whisk it, and return it to the heat, and allow it to raise in temperature for about 5 to 7 minutes until the crème anglaise thickens and can easily coat the back of a spoon. It's really important as you do this step to use a spatula so that you're constantly rubbing the bottom of the pan. This prevents any of the custard from sticking and burning to the bottom of the pan. This is Crème Anglaise 101. It sounds kind of fancy, but I promise you're just making a really, really yummy, rich sauce. You'll notice that the thickness has changed and that the waves coming off of the spatula are heavier and move more slowly across the surface of the custard, and that means it's done. I'm gonna check by also seeing if it coats the back of a spoon and sticks to it. That's perfect. I'm gonna set my crème anglaise to the side just to cool a little bit while I brush my pudding with the bourbon syrup. And you might be tempted after you've brushed some of the syrup on, thinking like, that's enough, you know, I don't need to use all of the syrup. You want to use all of the syrup. It will soak in, and I promise it's like, you need all of it. Here we have it, our bourbon-soaked Christmas pudding. It's really glossy, shiny, it smells like spices and bourbon. And now I'm gonna take my crème anglaise and I'm gonna pour some of it on top just to let it coat and drip around the Christmas pudding. But you'll have some extra, which you can save in a little glass to pour over each individual serving if someone wants more crème anglaise, and I'll go ahead and tell you that they will, because it's delicious. And there she is. All steamy, looks so good. As you're slicing, you'll notice that the Christmas pudding is pretty dense. but that's part of what makes it really lovely because it's also moist and hydrated from the bourbon syrup that you brushed all over it. I'm immediately tasting the really rich, sweet, caramelized flavor of the bourbon. And as you chew, you're just hitting different pieces of dried fruit. So you're getting the really soft dried plums and then some of the raisin and golden raisin, which is just a little bit sweeter. And the crystallized ginger flavors the whole thing. So it's got this spicy, gingery, Christmassy taste to it. It's incredible. I could also definitely taste the trio of cinnamon, nutmeg, and clove. It's unmistakably a winter dessert, but one that is dense and a little chewy, sweet, a little tangy from the bourbon, and then it's just coated in this warm, rich crème anglaise. I promise you, if you make this for the holiday, it will be appreciated, and you'll be impressed with yourself as you should be. If you give this a try, let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear how it goes and what you think. Thanks so much. See you next time. Bye.